All right, so our speaker is an assistant professor, just finished her second year at Bucknell. She's also on the leadership team for Data Science by Design, which celebrates the fundamental creativity of data science. Let's welcome Sara to the stage.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me? Good? All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a huge honor. I can't believe I'm up here. This is a big room. Today, I'm going to be talking about this idea of full stack communicators and what do I mean by that, but it's also about the age-old question like, wait, what do you mean, right? Whether your students are asking you that, you're asking that of your students, a collaborator is like, wait, what do you mean? Maybe you're right now saying, wait, what do you mean? I have to like learn and teach statistics, data science, tools, and now also communication, like what? And also as an aside, Kelly watched a video about how to write a keynote. Mine had different instructions. Start with the Justin Bieber meme, I don't know. Weird. But you might be asking me this question, and unfortunately I think yes, the answer is yes. Like we have to do all these things, but the good news is we're all in this together, right? We're a team, full eyes, full hearts, can't lose, right? So this talk is hopefully supposed to sort of bring us all together, celebrate what we're already doing about communication and not adding another thing we have to do on our plates, but trying to navigate what we're already doing and sort of messaging that a little stronger. So we've learned a lot over the course of this conference that communication encompasses lots of different types of actions and requires us to form a relationship with many different types of audiences. But sometimes the communication part can be invisible or undervalued labor in the whole process. When we sort of think about all of the data analysis and the visualizations, this part can get sort of lost. And what I want to talk about today is sort of how to make this less unsung, right? And so now another, wait, what do you mean? What do I mean by this idea of full stack? When I hear full stack, I think about all these sort of like buzzword tech jobs, but it sort of has this idea of a breadth of technical skills, but also it's performed in a role that spans the whole data-intensive workflow. So I want to think about a way that we can reframe communication to have these two qualities, both being a technical skill and also happening all throughout the process, not just at the very end. So this talk we're going to talk about spanning and technicality. So let's first talk about spanning. When I just did a Google search about data-intensive workflows, I cherry-picked a few here, and you might notice especially the top left one that comes from R for data science. But if we look at these, what do these all have in common? Communication is always at the end of this process, and it doesn't have that nice feedback iteration loop like all of the other parts. Even in the bottom left where there's like a lot more going on, all of the arrows still only go into the communication workflow. There's no sort of like reiteration. And I'm not bringing these up to pick on these, right? Of course, it's an oversimplified workflow, that's sort of the point, but it is sort of interesting when we're sort of messaging to our students like where communication falls. This, I feel like, is not really representative of what we do. And of course, these aren't the only workflows out there. Not all of them do this. Here's a few more. The one on the left, even though communication is at the end, there is sort of some arrows to show iteration, right? I'm a little biased about the one on the right because I was involved, but we have a little bit more about communication throughout the whole pipeline, although I don't feel like we got that iteration part correct, right? Like it's hard to do a good workflow, but the idea here is just that thinking about how we're talking about this, where are the mismatches between what we actually do and what we sort of present. All right. So the next part of the talk, I want to talk about different actions that count as communicating, and I want to sort of highlight things you might already be doing in your class that you might not be marketing as communication, right? And so I want to sort of give some ideas here, and then we can sort of think about how we might reframe to show that it spans that whole process instead of a thing you do at the end of the class. Throughout, I'm going to be showing some pictures of books from other fields that talk about writing, right? We're not the first people who have to teach writing, of course, like people in English, creative writing, and I've gotten a lot of inspiration from that literature because it's really been helpful to see other people work through that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we can do is think about the analogies between our work and their work. So I want to start with reading, which counts as writing in my book, and this process really helps us see how other people write so that we can sort of steal that, right? And so some books I like here, the first one is Writing with Mentors, which is about giving students sort of a suite of examples of the type of writing you want to do instead of one example. And then they have to sort of find the commonalities between those to sort of see, oh, these all have this in common. Maybe my writing should look like that. So it helps sort of give them some templates without giving it sort of an over-parameterized sense of what we're doing. Another book I really like is about annotation, because reading should be sort of active. It can feel passive, and that's what makes it sort of like not fun and like putting it in the communication framework. But annotation helps you sort of, oh, let's go back. Here we go. Annotation helps you sort of keep track of what you're supposed to be paying attention to. And I've always wanted to sort of do this in the classroom, but until I read this book, I didn't really know, like, what are the prompts I should use? And so we've got some good ideas here. But I want to start with reading because we're all doing it in our classes, whether we're communicating it as a communication step or not, right? Maybe you have students read about some sort of stats in the wild, right? Here's a 2-page spread from Significance magazine, which has a lot of good articles that are sort of written for a broad audience. And maybe you're having students read through them, and if you're doing that, they're likely taking notes. Right, so here's my beautiful scrawl of what I might take notes on this. And going through that process of signaling that is an action. It's also part of the technical process because they're keeping track of that information for a reason. They're writing down, okay, where's the problem located? Where's the solution? Where are all the nitty-gritty details? What's that plot doing there? Right, this is all giving them ideas for how they might proceed in their own writing. And just even flagging that takes 30 seconds in an activity you're already doing. It can sort of help students think early on about writing before they're even writing. And maybe you're not taking time out of your class to do a whole sort of reading session. That's fine. What everyone is certainly doing are word problems, right? My students are always like, there's so many words in this math class. And I'm like, yes, there are. And so reframing that word problem breakdown process as a technical skill, we're reading to find information we might need, that messaging can also be helpful. So I am going to read this so we're on the same page here. But as I'm reading, sort of keep track of the things you think might be useful for a typical sort of intro stats question, right? So I was listening to my running playlist, and it made me wonder if it had the same pump-up energy as a workout mix that was curated by Spotify. And so it turns out Spotify has data on all of this song information, including a measure of energy. And I wanted to compare a random sample of 50 songs from my playlist to what they report as their gold standard. So they report that the songs on their workout playlist have an average energy score of something like 0.75 with a standard deviation of 0.15, but the songs in my sample have a mean energy score of 0.71. Right now, of course, that's a mouthful, and students often struggle with this process of like, okay, where do I go from here? There's all these words. But now this is where the annotation comes in, right? So let me highlight some things I might care about. That same word seems important, right? I don't care if it's less, I don't care if it's greater, I just care if it's different, right? I have a random sample, that seems important. I have 50 songs. I have a reported mean and standard deviation, and then I have my mean. That all seems like relevant information. But I'm going to go a step further beyond highlighting, which is a passive way of reading, right? I think students love to highlight, but maybe the next step is a little bit harder. Why did I highlight these things, right? Well, that same word might signal that I might want to do a two-sided situation, right? Sounds like I have a random sample and a good sample size. That sounds like conditions for inference. I might want to map all those numbers to their notation, which ones are sort of standard ones and which ones are samples, right? And so you're already doing this. You're already trying to help students make this work, right? Flagging this as a reading and annotation and a writing process that is part of the technical skill of doing the problem, that can sort of just show that they're doing this all the time, right? It's not just in a final report. It's literally day to day. Right? And so again, you're already doing this, just signal it a little bit more, right? Okay, reading, we're on board. But now, what happens once I've read a bunch of stuff, I have all this stuff going on, or I've done a data analysis, I have a lot going on, now I need to organize my thoughts, right? This also counts as writing. The books I like here are twisty little passages. This is about interactive fiction, so think about choose your own adventure novels. I think they can give us a lot of good ideas about how to sort of get people interested in the work we're doing. And another great one is Meander, Spiral, Explode, about patterns in narrative beyond the sort of traditional, like, westernized storyline. I think students really like the I did this, I did this, I did this narrative, but sort of breaking them out of that and thinking about what did they find, or maybe there's a different sort of structure beyond the linear narrative and pushing them to do that. So I think thinking about how other people do that can help us teach that too. Now, if you've seen me talk before, I love the organizing step. I love the storyboarding idea. So if you've heard me before, you'll bear with me. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this today. I heard that this also got highlighted somewhere else, and so that's great. I love a storyboard. I, of course, didn't invent this idea, right? This comes from the movies. It's a high-level sense of what the movie's going to be about, right? It's all pictures. You can get a sense of what Finding Nemo is going to look like from this picture here. You can do the same thing with really any statistical outcome. Maybe you have a bunch of plots. Maybe you have a bunch of notes from a reading, right? You need a way to sort of group things that go together, filter out stuff you don't really need, order them in a way beyond what you actually did. Maybe the first plot you ever made is not the first plot that goes in your report, right? And so you're really trying to break down and find the bigger picture. Now this you might not already be doing in your class, but I wanted to give an example to give you a sense of how you might work it in, because it can come at a lot of different stages. So what I just did in a first-year seminar for incoming students is I had them make plots about Bucknell, right? So they're new, they're trying to learn about how to be a college student, they're learning a little bit of data. They learned how to make these plots in Data Wrapper. Look how nice they look after only a couple weeks in school, right? And I just gave them a ton of data about Bucknell from our sort of fact book, and I was like, do something that interests you, right? And so you'll see just a handful here. Some people cared about sports, some people cared about first generation, some people cared about sort of the gender breakdown in different parts of the university. Some people wanted to look at SAT scores or how much they can expect to make after graduation. So I just sort of let them go wild. I said, make a bunch of plots. But then what I made them do is get together in groups, and they had to make a story of everybody in their group's plots. So if I made a bunch about sports and somebody else made a bunch of stuff about SATs, we now have to find some link to sort of make a story together. And so once they did that, then we merge groups again, and they have to revise that story to include the other group's narrative. And so it's just a fun way to sort of see what you think is your story can evolve as you sort of bring in other people's perspectives. Now you don't have to have students make their own plots. You can give them plots. It doesn't even have to be visual. This can be more text-based. But it's just an interesting sort of approach to make them sort of move things around. I printed these, and they'd be going like this, or they'd be on Google Slides rearranging. And what they end up looking like, here's an example of one story. So they just got to Bucknell. They were like, I want to go through my process as a student through the data. So what did I have to do to get here? I took the SATs, then I had to be accepted, then I had to actually enroll. And now once I'm here, what are the opportunities available to me? How many people do research experiences, right? And then what do I expect to make afterwards? That's sort of that trajectory. And I thought that was a smart sort of storyline to sort of trace themselves through the data. And so all that does is we went from that mismatch of plots to now an ordering sort of from left to right, top to bottom. We see the SATs to acceptance rates to enrollment, et cetera, right? And so it takes a long time to get this to work. And we did this over a course of many days. I know not everyone can do that. This was a specialized course where we had a lot more freedom. But if you can think of that mentality of how can you get them to sort of pause what they're doing and organize their thoughts, I think that can be really beneficial. It breaks them out of this I did this, I did this, I did this checklist writing mentality. All right. Now where else do you organize your thoughts? Well, when you're speaking, right? So I actually did a little storyboarding myself doing this talk because I really have to I'm a little bit chaotic. I'm all over. I'm oh, do I want to talk about this here? I don't know. This speaking slide was later in the talk a couple weeks ago, right? And so you can do that with slides too. It's another great place to do storyboarding. And maybe you're doing speaking at the end of a final project. Maybe you're just having students do a little presentation during class. Whatever you're doing, they still have to organize that. It's really hard to give a snap talk, we've learned today. I'm now learning it's just as hard to give a big one. Who knew? But I mean, the thing is you have to plan. And we sometimes sort of skip that part when we're teaching. The book I like here is Save the Cat. It's about screenwriting, and it breaks down the structure of a blockbuster movie. And I think that can be really helpful, not only for the components of a good story, but also the pacing, right? How do you give a 5-minute talk? How do you give a 20-minute talk? And thinking about how you would tell that same blockbuster story in different time frames. And plus, it's just a fun one. I think students can connect to sort of videos and things like that. All right, so speaking is something where you need to organize. Another thing where you have to organize is actually coding, right? Coding counts as writing in a lot of different ways, right? Writing the actual code, reading and writing documentation, that counts, right? Comments to yourself or future people, that counts. Even pseudocode, that's the real planning of the actual writing. All of that is writing, and I don't think we make that connection enough. Why I think we need to do it better is because coding feels the most technical. So if we can link coding to writing here, that'll help our sort of argument about technicality that we'll talk about later. Right? Coding counts as writing. Good strategies for telling stories with data also include telling good stories with your code, right? And so I think if we're doing that, we can mention that, right? That counts as writing. Now, these two books are on my to-read list, I must admit, but they're next up because I think this is the place where I have the most room to grow, right? How am I messaging the teaching coding? I think we can learn a lot by thinking of it as writing instead of a separate thing, okay? Okay, now we're going to get back to sort of the more traditional pieces of writing. Like, of course, we eventually have to write something, right? We have to do a draft. When I saw this comic in Regina's talk, I was like, yes, I have done something right. Like, we are on the same length here. So how do we get words on the page, right? So at this point, I want to sort of get a little crafty for a second. Bear with me. If anyone has a piece of paper, now would be a good time to just grab that out. If you don't, a phone or whatever in your mind, on your tablet, whatever. But I want to actually get some words down on paper ourselves here, because I think often, like, when I go to these talks, I'm like all jazzed, and then when I get home tomorrow, I'm like, oh no, where do I start, right? Like, I'm like, I don't have a good action item, so I want us to like leave with some plans here. Another thing I want to show here is that when I'm overwhelmed about writing, this is a way I trick myself into writing, is writing on smaller pieces of paper. So if you fold it in thirds, you can definitely fill a little strip of paper, right? That seems doable. I'll write on little stickies, like anything to trick myself into saying, like, I only have to write this much, right? So I wanted to do that now. If you have the physical piece of paper, fold it in threes. If not, just work with whatever you got. To prove that I'm not making this up, this is the note card where I first sketched out ideas for this talk when I got the email from Alan Kelly being like, it's time for an abstract, and I was like, oh no. And so you can see that like some stuff is coming out. I even like have a little doodle there. So far so good, right? And so it all just took a little note card to get me going, right? Okay, so what are we putting on this piece of paper for you? So there are 3 columns in theory. On the first column, I want you to think about what you're already doing that counts as communication. It's really a lot. Hopefully, as we started talking, you already are like, oh yeah, I do that. Oh yeah, I do that, right? So we want to celebrate that, like, we don't have to do all new stuff. You're already doing stuff. In the middle, is there just a way you can emphasize the role of that communication piece, where it comes in the workflow, and also its value? Is there a way to make it a little bit like shinier or technical, right? And then on the third column, I don't want to like leave you out in the cold, like, who are you going to reach out to when you need some help? Maybe it's somebody you've met at this conference so far. Maybe it's somebody at your institution. And if you can't think of anyone, you can put my name down. Happy to cheerlead for whoever, right? And I just want to take 3 minutes to literally just get some words on the page, right? I want us to sort of get past that blank slate so that we wake up tomorrow feeling like we got a plan, all right? And feel free to talk to one another. I am going to use this little timer so that we can stay on board. So 3 minutes, try to do a minute a column maybe, just get some ideas down. And you can chat, it'll be an awkward 3 minutes otherwise. All right, maybe let's come back. Hopefully you have some ideas going. Please keep it coming as we keep going. All right, we're going to talk through some other parts of that I think count as writing, and hopefully you'll get some more ideas. All right, onward. Okay, so now we're still in the drafting mode, so let's flag a potential pain point. Let's be honest about what happens when we start drafting with students, right? If you think about any writing assignment you've ever given, you probably gave them a set of instructions, maybe you gave them an example, maybe you gave them a rubric, maybe you gave them some sort of checklist, right? And I am the queen of writing every little thing down because I'm ooh, I want this, and trying to be really clear. And I thought that I was doing a good job of this, and then I read this, and I felt really called out, right? So I read this book, and there's this line. It says, handing students a template should not be our default response to struggle. And I was just that is 100% me. Every time I see something that I don't want to happen in another writing assignment, I put it on the instructions for next time, right? I thought that maybe that was a good thing. And I'm not saying it's definitely not a good thing, but what Jennifer is saying is that if you over-structure it, students never learn the sort of conditional knowledge of when to do what. Does this rubric or instructions transfer to another writing scenario I have to do? Is this just a bespoke thing I'm doing this one time for my professor? And so if you over-structure it, students don't know when there's something that you want them to do every time they're writing. Oh, should I do this for a paper in another class? Is this just in this class? Is this just for this weird assignment? And so this made me really sort of walk back some other things that I had done before. I even, I'll admit, gave a whole JSM talk last summer about very extensive checklists and the transparency behind those. And I don't think that that's necessarily bad, and I'm not going to stop doing them, but I might sort of do it a little less, or maybe just at the beginning and sort of take off the guardrails as we go, because I think this really hit home for me, is that we can't always just list everything we do and don't want students to do. They don't learn from that, or we need to give them the opportunity to learn that sort of conditional knowledge of when am I doing these things? How do I really make decisions about why I should be doing those things? And so I just want to flag that, because I've definitely preached the opposite, and I'm walking it back. That's what I'm saying. And Jennifer was really nice about this. When I reached out to her, I was like, this is me, what do I do? And she's like, don't worry, this happens, right? It's a process. Okay, out of the pitfall zone here. Another thing that counts as communicating that I think we're pretty much all on board now with is visualization, right? But I want to sort of talk beyond the nice graphics that come out of something like R and talk about visualization more broadly. So what about those sort of science graphics that are those big, beautiful magazine spreads that really walk us through a process? That counts as writing, right? Even just drawing to think, right? Doodling, right? You saw my little doodle on my note card, that got me somewhere, right? I'm a really big fan of the zine, which is a little pamphlet you made out of a sheet of paper. After the talk, if you bring me a piece of paper, I'll make you one. But it's this idea of making a little comic, and so it's a blend of sort of text and visuals and thinking about breaking that down. I'll give an example in a second. And then I think the thing that's made the rounds the most in this community is maybe something like Dear Data, where you take data on yourself, that sort of personal data, and you make it more artistic. And so I'm bringing this up because I think we have to also value the communication that looks different than the stuff we might be traditionally doing. We want to teach students to make good visualizations, but we should also maybe think about opportunities for drawing, right? It doesn't all have to come from the computer. Maybe we want to assign comics, right? XKCD has taught me a lot, right? And so just thinking about visualization a little bit beyond what we already think about, that counts as writing too. This is an example of an explainer zine I did with some colleagues about making a comic about an academic paper as a way to experiment about trying to get that message out to a broader audience. So here are some panels from one about sort of a data visualization research paper, so it got a little meta here. But I'm showing this mainly because, one, you don't have to feel like you're an excellent drawer to make this work. I think XKCD has humanized and made it acceptable to draw stick figures, and I appreciate that. I can't draw to save my life. But these can really resonate with students. So I did zines in my first year seminar, and the students who loved it, and the students who didn't love it, right? But there were a group of students who really doubled down on this, did it for one of their final projects. They got really creative. And I think it's another one of those constrained approaches, right? I can make a little comic. That doesn't feel as overwhelming as doing some big project. but it's still really powerful. And it's also that gets to this sharing mentality. You can pass out a zine at a conference. It's just kind of like a nice community space there. I could talk about zines forever, but I just wanted to flag that as something like you might try out if you have, just an extra day, a day before a break, right? When you expect maybe half of your students to be there, this is a good thing to maybe just try out, see where it goes. Okay, another thing that counts as writing, revising, right? And actually this is the part that I think we spend the most time on as people who write, but maybe not as teachers teaching writing, because we just run out of time, right? We want to give students the maximum time to do the drafting, and then it's the end of the semester and we're all done, right? And so building in time for students to revisit things, even if it's not a final project that you iterate over multiple times, even if it's just little parts of the course, that opportunity to show that you're not done after the first round. You're not done after the second round, really, but I mean, there's only a limit to what we can do here. But there are a lot of great books about revision. Some ones that have helped me, the Subversive Copy Editor is about the people process of editing, how do you interface as a copy editor to a writer, and that has helped me actually a lot about how to give feedback. You have to do that in a human way, and thinking about that, not over smoothing, for example. Refuse to be Done is about editing your novel, which maybe we aren't doing right now, but we're still telling stories, right? And there's a lot to sort of think about in terms of that iteration and tightening the story. On revision, the writing that counts, right? Showing that that's the exciting part of the writing process. I think that's hard to sell people on, but I think it's true. And then something that's not directly revision, but still sort of falls into this is the idea of writing with brevity, right? I am guilty of this. When I revise, it just gets longer and longer, right? And I think students do this too, and thinking about can we revise by actually making it shorter? Can we cut things? Can we make things more efficient? And giving students the opportunity to do this at some point. And this is hard. We'll talk about that in a second, but I wanted to show a short activity instead of sort of a big final project related one, which is maybe where it's most obvious. So I do this activity with my first year seminar, modeling the revision process, but also having a sort of embracing vulnerability part, where I take examples from my own writing. I have just a folder of all my revise and resubmits, right? And I just pull from them and say, okay, this is what I turned in, this is what the reviewer said, and then this is what I sent back, right? And then I have students try to predict how I'm gonna make the change and then compare it to my change. And I do this for academic writing, a paper, and also for writing for broader audiences. So I've written for various blogs where I had editor feedback and we go through those different audiences. Students love this because up until now, I've been picking on their writing for the whole semester, and now they get to give me a little bit back, right? And it's just so humanizing because they're oh my gosh, Professor Stout, you turned this in? And I was yes, I did. That's what I said. And they love it because well, maybe you'll tell me now, I can get long-winded. And so when you read a sentence out loud, it's you hear yourself take that breath, and they always laugh. And but this, I think, is really nice because it takes 5 minutes. You just do one at the end of class, you have an extra piece of time. It's easy if you have this sort of you probably have somewhere a document with something like this. If you don't have revise and resubmit sort of papers, maybe just emails, proposals, anything. It doesn't have to be the whole thing, just a sentence, right? And they'll spend a lot of time just workshopping that one sentence. I was actually being observed when I did this, and I got a great tip from my colleague because she noticed that they were completely rewriting me, which is fine, but she was think about if you were more of a copy editor, you don't want to rewrite the whole voice of the person. Can you make the smallest change to make that revision? And so I think next time I'm going to do that in 2 waves, rewrite as if you were doing it, and then rewrite as if you were not trying to change me, but just make it a little bit tighter, and we can have that conversation. I think that's going to be really interesting. And it gets back to that idea of not over smoothing. So again, this is something you might just throw in. You have a little extra time. It doesn't have to be this huge, big revision assignment. But it can also help show your students that you are a writer and that you're not a perfect writer either, right? We're constantly giving feedback that can come off as a little bit negative, only celebrating or not celebrating the sort of weaknesses, and this can show that we do it too, right? Now when we talk about revision, there's an obvious pain point here, right? Feedback, right? How do you do this at scale? How do you do it quickly? How do you do it frequently? And I'm not here to give you any magic wisdom there. This is my white whale. I don't know how to do this, but I think this is where we need to sort of innovate. So when I talked to Jennifer, actually, she gave me these book tips, which I'm going to read this summer, but I think I'm going to just share it with you because I trust her. Flash feedback, that sounds like that's going to help me, right? But also thinking about this mechanically inclined book is about the grammar part of it. If you find yourself always focusing on that rather than the statistics, like, can we do that more efficiently? So I think there's some stuff to do here. I haven't solved it. If you all solve it, let me know. But I think, like, this is really, like, we have to acknowledge this is a pain point. We can't just introduce infinite revision without thinking about how we're going to scale this. So I admit that, like, that is the limiting factor, but I still think we can be creative about doing it in sort of little nuggets, if not on a big scale. All right? Okay, so hopefully at this point we've sort of seen the spanning, right? I've talked about a lot of different actions that count. Hopefully you have some ideas on your sheet about, you're already doing this, right? Just flag it. It happens not at the end of the semester, right? It happens everywhere. But now I want to talk about the technicality piece of the full stack communicator and how that relates to our sort of our identity as statisticians, data scientists, educators, students, writers, right? Why is there that piece? Why am I going to sort of push that full stack harder? This might be the most controversial thing I say. I really want us to say that communication is a technical skill, not a soft one. I want to banish soft skill as a term. I think it's the messaging that says that's why it's always at the end of the flowchart. That's why we always run out of time to do it, because we're working on the stats part, right? And I know we're running out of time, and like this is the thing that has to go, right? But if we elevate communication to part of the technical process, it won't always get punted to the side. And also the people who are strong at communicating won't always be that sort of afterthought person. Oh, just give it to so-and-so, they'll polish it up, right? And this is where I want to get vulnerable for a second, because even though we're in this huge room, I feel like I'm among friends, right? Like every time somebody says, oh, Sarah, you're such a good communicator, I like flinch a little bit. And like my gut feeling is like, but I'm a good statistician too, right? Like as if I did not just stand up here and give this whole talk about how they're the same thing, as if I don't work on this and like get validation from working on this, but like I still feel that way as my gut reaction. And so like part of that is a me problem, I accept that. But I think that there's like a kernel of truth in that gut reaction. And that's what sort of motivated this whole framing of the talk, right? I think we as a community, we do value communication, but I don't always feel like we sell it in the same way as we sell some of those more traditional technical skills. So if we can agree on this, I think we can make a lot of progress. People will own that sort of identity as a communicator. You can be both a communicator and a good statistician. It takes both, right? It's not an either-or thing. But just because I want to elevate communication to a technical role doesn't mean I want it to be anti-human, right? Like I don't want to erase the humanness of communication, the personal touch of it. And I think this comes with, we need to start cultivating and valuing individual voices, right? We heard this from other speakers today, right? We don't want to sort of make cookie cutters of ourselves when we're teaching communication, right? Yes, there's a right and wrong way to talk about confidence intervals and p-values, sure. But there's a broader sense of communication that we don't want to over-smooth. And I am very guilty of this. I'm a very opinionated feedback giver. I think my students would agree. But when I was doing this first year seminar where it wasn't about the stats, I really wanted to change how I was giving feedback because I didn't have to be as picky about sort of like those technical pieces. And so I got some great ideas from this Craft in the Real World book about workshopping fiction, right? How do you give feedback in a way that's constructive but doesn't sort of like change the story that the person wants to tell? And so this helped me decide that I was only going to give feedback as questions for at least the first part of the semester to see how it goes. So instead of marking everybody's paper with whatever, I was going to say like, what if you did this here? Or how could you strengthen this with an example, right? Phrasing what I wanted to say as a question helped, one, slow me down so I wasn't just like scribbling over everything, which is demoralizing, I get that. But also thinking about it, the students as like, they have agency. They can answer the question. Maybe they can choose to rebut the question, right? Like, I don't want to do that, and here's why. And so it became more of a conversation, and this helped me tailor my feedback in a way that felt like I wasn't over-smoothing what they were trying to do. Like I wasn't trying to rewrite what they were saying so that it sounded better to me, but I was just trying to help like mold their own sort of sense of voice. And this gets back to the sort of the invisible art of literary editing book here about like how do you edit without inserting yourself in the process. And so I got a lot of help from books like this because I was doing that. I was inserting myself. I was trying to like make them write more like me, right? And no one needs to write like me. Like that's not some gold standard, right? And so this helped me really shape, okay, like how can I bring this back to the intro stat classroom where there are sort of things that like are right or wrong, but still trying to use this mentality. And along with this, like, how do we value when students want to tell stories that are different than what we might want them to tell with the data, right? Not what we were expecting. So there's a lot of this idea about personal narratives in data, like that's what the DEAR data is about. How can we sort of bring that out in more traditional final reports when they're analyzing a data set? If they want to do something a little sort of off the beaten path, like how do we let that happen, right? I'm glad that I'm not the only one up here to talk about poetry. I thought it would be, but another great book is this Poetry Pauses. It's about teaching writing through poetry in all different ways. And you're like, well, I can't do that in my class. I tried out with this foundation seminar a crossover event with the intro poetry class. There's a lot of math and poetry, a lot of like different sort of structures based on math. And it was really fun. I mean, well, I thought it was really fun. We'll see. But like just creative things like that. You can't do it in every class. I know like intro stat there's a lot going on, but just thinking about these like moments where you have, oh, you cut a day on something and like, oh, I want to do something interesting here. Like broaden what that could look like because you might be cultivating some voice that didn't feel like it could like sort of pipe up in the same way as before. So I want it to be a technical skill, but not that we're all writing like robots, like literally, right? So we have to find that balance. And at this point, like, I want to thank people who helped cultivate my own voice, right? There have been lots of people who have helped me on my statistician journey, but there are also people who specifically helped me on my writing journey, and I want to talk about that now as just sort of like an anecdote, and also that we should be these for each other, right? And so, of course, as Kelly said, like, I would not be up here without Deb Nolan, right? And so she was the first person who was like, yeah, Sarah, like, of course you could help develop this class and help teach it, and like, oh, we're gonna write a book. And I was just like, we are? And she's like, yeah, of course. And like, I could give a whole talk of like, when Deb Nolan asks you to do something, you say yes, right? Like, this is one of those moments. But navigating that idea of like, who am I to teach writing? I think we all feel that way because like, we were not trained in that, but we have to claim that identity as writer, right? We have to help each other do that. Another team I want to thank is the data desk at the LA Times. So I interned there one summer, and that experience helped me really navigate being both a statistician and a writer. It was one of those things where I felt like it was either or, like I had to double down on teaching writing or I had to double down on my technical skills. And that experience helped me think like, okay, I can actually do both of these things. Because they both helped me with my sort of like coding chops and like how do you munge all this wild data, but also they taught me how to be a reporter. Like you have to talk to people, you have to call people on the phone and ask them about their stories, right? And that sort of human element I think has been really helpful even now when I'm teaching, right? And so before that I had really like struggled with like, I do still struggle, like why am I up here, for example, but like it takes those people to really double down on you. And I just want to say like we should all do that for each other, but we also have to do that for our students. We have to say, yes, you are a writer. You are a statistician too, like those are the same thing, essentially, right? We have to sort of elevate both of those as the same roles, and we have to sort of help ourselves do that, right? So thank you to those people, and I hope you all thank the people who are calling you a writer in your life. All right, I feel like I've been talking a long time, so I want to wrap up. I have to do some plugs before I unleash you for questions. Of course, if you haven't checked out the book, Communicating with Data, yet, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you're using it in class, I want to know what's working and what's not. If you're thinking about using it but you need some support, like that's what I'm here for. This book has a lot of good examples. Oh, well, good, I shouldn't hype myself up, but a lot of exercises. Like it's a great book for being a guide for something like Introstat, where you're not maybe explicitly teaching writing, but you want them to have some reference for their reports. If you're doing a class on communication itself, this is a good guide if you need something just to start with. Please reach out if you're thinking about it. Another project I'm involved with is the Data Science by Design initiative. So we put out an anthology called The Future of Data Science last year that embraces all of this creativity, like you'll see art and fiction. Our next issue is coming out next week, Wednesday. It's about the environment, and I did not think we could do better than the first one, and this one, I gotta say, it is. There's a data quilt. I'm just gonna just tease. You're gonna want to see it. It's very cool. And so check that out. And then for students in the room, if you're thinking about like, yes, I want to cultivate that voice, check out Math Stat Bites. This is an initiative where grad students write blog posts about the cutting edge stats research, but they do it for an undergrad audience. So they need grad student writers, but they also need undergrad reviewers as the target audience and getting that experience doing peer review. So check that out if you're thinking about like, I want to get some hands-on experience. I can also talk about like what that looks like if people are interested. But with that, I think I'm going to stop for a bit, put the onus on you to ask questions. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we'll do this like we have been with all of the keynotes, where you should raise your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you, and if you say it loud enough, that's great. If you don't, I'll repeat it so everyone can hear your question. All right, any questions for Sarah? Alan.
You mentioned the term over-smoothing several times about the writing process. Can you say more about that, please?
Yeah, so what do I mean by the over-smoothing? I think it's the difference between like saying this sentence could be stronger, or like maybe there's an example here, or maybe this is really 2 sentences, and like rewriting the sentence, or like picking on word choice. I do this a little bit. Things that like you have a stylistic preference that is affecting your reader ability. Like I try to give stream of conscious feedback so they know like what I'm thinking when I'm reading and what's slowing me down. But sometimes like that over opinion of like my reader experience taking over the writer's experience, I think is like this over smoothing. So it's like you want to give feedback that strengthens it for not just you, I think, which is something I tend to struggle with, but also sort of like noticing like what could be strengthened, but also helping them figure out how to strengthen it instead of you just saying, if you did this, it would strengthen it, right? Because you could do it a different way and it could be better. It's just you haven't thought of it that way. So trying to like let go a little bit of the control over the revision process and just trying to be more of a guide rather than a literal rewriter, I think is what I mean by that. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Remember the day in early March I gave you feedback on your abstract?
I do.
I was over-smoothing? I think I was, based on what you just said.
No.
So if you didn't hear, Alan said he may have possibly over-smoothed Sarah's abstract when she sent it to us, and he would like honest feedback from her while she's on stage.
No, I think that the feedback that like, if I had read it in the future, I would have told myself the same thing. Like, I think that was what that feedback was. It's sort of like, it's the thing that I needed to hear to do it. Like, I'm like, oh, this is good enough, I'm sending it. And like, you need the person to come back and be like, you know it could be better. Like, I feel like it was in the spirit of where I would have been heading if I had not run out of steam, maybe. And so I do not feel over-smoothed by you, don't worry. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing I have noticed is that if it's less of a like checklist of feedback, they can't just be like, yes, I did this, yes, I did this, yes, I did this. When it's in the form of the question, there's no like immediate thing they can just do and call it quits. And so I do think it like makes them slow down in the revision process, and then it opens up, like they're not just gonna fix that little thing, like the stuff around it is required to like answer the question. So I do think that has been helpful. I think I could do a better job of giving more space to like go back and forth. So like it might take a couple iterations for that question to be fully like answered, and sometimes I feel like we're just on to the next thing before that happens. But I do think it's sort of like, it's less of a like boom, 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 copy edit, I'm done, and it's more of like, oh, I actually have to like rethink this whole thing. I'm just gonna deal with this real quick. Yes.
It seems like most of the advice has been about individual writing.
Yes, I'm glad you asked this question, because this is a hard thing, and often we do final projects in groups. I think the reality is that students are dividing and conquering. They're like, I'm going to do this section, you're going to do this section. So I'm trying to like focus most of my attention on the this time smoothing in a good way across sections. Like, is it obvious when people switch writers? Like, training them to be like, do you see what I'm seeing here? Like, it's clear that somebody wrote this and somebody wrote that. So I think just like meeting students where they are, like they're gonna do that, and focusing on the like edges of like, okay, if you wrote the intro and somebody else did the methods, how do you work on the transitions between those pieces? And trying to focus on that. Some things that I wanna try, I can't say that this definitely works yet, but like making them read it out loud, right? Because they will then see like, oh, it's obvious now. But I think when they're editing their own piece, they don't see that. They don't see where it fits in. And so like making them zoom back out and actually like go through that process. But yeah, it's a huge challenge because they're definitely collaborative writing on these big projects, and we collaboratively write as writers. And so like training that. It's also a people conversation, just navigating people problems when you're writing, and that's a whole other thing.
Thank you. Okay, so, you know, I often have students who, when they're stats or math majors, say, like, but I'm a stats or math major because I don't want to be a writer. And then I have this like terrible answer where I try to tell them it's important. Do you have a compelling argument you give to the student who says something like that?
That's hard, because yes, I hear that all the time. It's like, well, tough. But I think like the argument I make is like, do you want to be heard? It's like, do you want people to act on this? Like, then you have to work on this skill, right? Like, you don't want to be doing math into the void. Like, you're maybe into statistics because it feels like you can make a change, and you can only do that if you like communicate to someone what you've done. And so I think if you try to like give them opportunities to be like, beyond you, because I think this is the other thing, like we're not an authentic audience. Like, do you want to change my mind? Like, they don't care, right? But like, if you think about like, okay, if you were using this for a real audience and you really want like policymakers to make a change based on this, like you have to leverage that skill too. It's hard though, because yes, you hear that a lot. It's like, I have self-selected into this. But I think they have to come around. I mean, like at some point, or they'll do something else. I mean, but now I'm rambling. That is my.
That was good. That was a good answer. Good answer. Other questions? Yeah. There.
Yeah, I think my number one advice is like, use your resources on campus. Do you have a writing center? Do you have a teaching and learning center? Something like that where like there are professionals who know way more about that than we do, right? And showing students those resources, not as like a remedial thing, but that everyone can take advantage of. And show like that you do that too. It's like when we write, we get feedback from other people. So like humanizing it so that's like, okay, it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm a bad writer, I have to do this extra thing, but like everybody can go to the writing center and get some extra help. Writing groups, like having a community of writers. We do that as academics, and like showing that both as like a career path, but also as a way to support students. Like students could team up, right? Or if there's a student who actually like wants to pursue a writing more focused career, like that's a good opportunity for them to help their peers. So like you might be able to sort of make connections that way. Like you might have a student newspaper, and those folks might want to get in touch with your class about like, hey, how do you write for broader audiences? So I think it's like leverage, you don't have to do it all yourself, like point people to the resources, but also show that that's like a natural part of writing. It's not just like a thing that some people have to do. It's that like we all should be doing this.
Other questions? Okay, question. Good, Chris. Thank you.
We talked a little bit, Chris Kamal, talked a little bit about, I think, writing for code. Just maybe a couple sentences about that, some practice around that topic.
Yeah, so the question was about writing for code and Sarah's thoughts on that.
Yeah, and this is the thing I need to most work on. So like I'm open ears. But thinking about it as like writing literally on a piece of paper first, or like mapping out what you're going to be doing instead of jumping right into the code, like doing that organizational planning step, like the pseudocode. I'm sort of really interested in like, can we just like focus more on that? Like, is it really about the syntax, or it's like, what am I doing to make this thing happen? Like, what does the data have to start looking like, and what does it have to end looking like before I can make this plot? Like, that's a very visual thing we could be doing on paper, right? We don't have to do it on the screen. I also think like reading code is an interesting opportunity. Like, how do we like parse what's going on? How do I do it and how to model it? I'm not great at like the live coding, like what's going on, and like, but better like organizing, like where are my eyes going in the code when I'm looking for something? Maybe when I'm debugging, like what's that process look like? And so trying to flag more of those things that we do without thinking and trying to narrate that process is something I'm working on. But my coding practices are not always like the things I want to be teaching necessarily. So it's hard, but I think, yeah, thinking about reading the code and also the planning for code and thinking about how that can go like off the screen first to feel more like tactile and then go back to the computer. But other ideas welcome.
Okay, let's thank Sarah.